Hello, and welcome to Whispers of the Gods. Tonight, we travel to Venice, but not the Venice of selfie sticks and cruise ships. Not the Venice drowning beneath the weight of 10 million visitors each year. No, we journey to a Venice that most have forgotten ever existed. A Venice of unimaginable power. A Venice that ruled the waves and commanded emperors. A Venice that was not a tourist destination, but a living, breathing empire that controlled the fate of half the known world. Imagine, if you will, a city born not from conquest, but from terror. A place that should never have existed, built upon foundations of desperation and mud, where refugees fleeing barbaric hordes decided to make their stand, not on solid ground, but on the shifting surface of a lagoon. Picture a place where the streets themselves were made of water, where children learned to row before they learned to walk, where the very act of survival required a daily negotiation with the sea. This was La Serenissima, the most serene republic. For over 1,000 years, from the shadows of the Dark Ages until the age of Napoleon, Venice stood as one of the great powers of the Mediterranean world. It was a republic when most of Europe bowed to kings. It was a commercial empire when warfare defined power. It was a place of revolutionary ideas clothed in ancient ritual, where democracy and oligarchy danced together in an intricate ballet of checks and balances that would influence political thought for centuries to come. It was a place of revolutionary ideas clothed in ancient ritual, where democracy and oligarchy danced together in an intricate ballet of checks and balances that would influence political thought for centuries to come. What we explore tonight is not the Venice of glass figurines and gondola rides, but the Venice of iron and ambition, of revolutionary shipyards and monopolistic trade, of masked intrigue and diplomatic genius. We will walk through a city where pepper was worth more than gold, where a single shipyard could produce a warship in a day, where merchants became princes and princes became merchants, all in service to a republic that valued the state above all else. So, breathe deeply, once more. Let the gentle lap of water against ancient stone fill your ears. Smell the salt air mixing with distant spices, cinnamon and cloves carried from impossibly far lands. Feel the cool evening mist rising from the canals. And now, let us begin our journey to the forgotten empire of Venice, before the tourists arrived, in the dying light of the 5th century. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed into chaos and darkness, the world that had seemed eternal for so many generations simply ceased to be. The great Roman roads that had carried legions and merchants across continents fell silent. The magnificent cities with their forums and aqueducts and bathhouses stood increasingly empty, their populations fleeing before wave after wave of invading peoples from the east and north. Among these invaders, none struck more terror into the hearts of the civilized world than the Huns. They came like a storm from the endless steppes of Asia, mounted warriors who seemed to live on horseback, who could ride for days without rest, whose composite bows could pierce Roman armor at distances that seemed impossible. Under their leader Attila, they swept across Europe like a scythe through wheat, burning cities and enslaving populations. The old certainties died before them. In northeastern Italy, in a region known as Venetia, the prosperous Roman citizens watched with growing horror as the Huns drew closer. These were people who had known nothing but relative peace and prosperity for generations. Merchants and farmers and craftsmen who had lived comfortable lives under the protection of Roman law and Roman legions. Now that protection was gone, crumbling like old parchment, and death was riding toward them on swift horses. When Attila's forces finally swept through the region in the middle of the 5th century, destroying the great city of Aquila and everything in their path, the people of Venetia made a desperate choice. They gathered what they could carry, their children and their elderly, their most precious possessions, their sacred objects, and they fled toward the one place that cavalry could not follow. They fled to the water. The coastal lagoon that would become Venice was not a promising refuge. It was a desolate, windswept expanse of shallow water, dotted with small muddy islands and treacherous sandbars. It was a place where malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in the brackish water, where winter storms could sweep in from the Adriatic with devastating force, where fresh water was scarce and the land itself seemed to shift with every tide. It was inhabited only by a few hardy fishermen and salt workers who lived in rough wooden huts and eked out meager existences from the sea. But it offered one thing that nowhere else could provide in that moment of terror: safety. The Huns could not bring their horses into the shallow, confusing waterways. The islands, connected by nothing but water and knowledge, formed a natural fortress that no land army could penetrate. And so the refugees came, first in dozens, then in hundreds, then in thousands, until the muddy islands were crowded with displaced people who had lost everything except their lives and their determination to survive. These first Venetians had to reinvent everything. They had to learn to live entirely from the sea, to fish and harvest salt, and trade these simple goods for the grain and wine and building materials they desperately needed. They had to adapt to a world where boats were not luxuries, but necessities, where every trip to draw fresh water from a well was an expedition, where the flooding tides could destroy a home in hours if it was not properly built. And built they did, through trial and error, through ingenuity born of desperation. They developed a revolutionary method of construction. They would drive thousands upon thousands of wooden piles deep through the soft mud, pushing them down until they hit the harder clay beneath. These piles, cut from the forests of the mainland and floated down to the lagoon, would then be driven so close together that they formed an underwater forest, a solid foundation beneath the unstable surface. On top of these pilings, they would lay thick platforms of timber, and only then would they begin to construct the stone foundations of their buildings. It was a technique that required immense labor, incredible amounts of wood, and a deep understanding of how water and mud and timber interact. But it worked. Buildings constructed this way could stand for centuries, their foundations gripping the earth through the water with unexpected strength. As decades passed and then centuries, as new waves of invaders swept across mainland Italy, more refugees came to the lagoon. The settlement grew from a desperate refuge into a permanent community, from scattered fishing villages into something that began to resemble a proper town. The people developed their own identity, their own way of life that was neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, but something entirely new, born of water and necessity. They remained officially part of the Byzantine Empire, that remnant of Roman glory that ruled from Constantinople. But in practice, in their daily lives and their commerce and their governance, they were already becoming independent, already developing the unique political and commercial genius that would one day make them masters of the Mediterranean. The city born from terror was learning to dream of empire, as the scattered settlements of the lagoon coalesced into what would become the city of Venice. Its people faced a profound challenge that would shape their entire future. They had fled tyranny, had abandoned their homes to escape the brutal rule of warlords and invading kings. They had seen what happened when too much power concentrated in too few hands, when ambition and cruelty combined in a single individual. Their deepest fear was not foreign invasion but domestic tyranny, the nightmare of one of their own becoming a despot who would crush the very freedom they had died to preserve. Yet they also needed leadership. They needed someone to speak for them to the Byzantine Empire, to lead them in war when threatened, to settle disputes and organize their common defense. The challenge was to create a system of government strong enough to protect them, but constrained enough never to threaten them. What they created was perhaps the most ingenious political system of the medieval world, a machine of checks and balances so elaborate that it would function for over 1,000 years. In the 8th century, they established the office of the Doge, from the Latin word dux, meaning leader. But this was to be a leader unlike any other in Europe. He was elected for life, but not by popular vote, in the way we might understand it. He was chosen by the city's wealthy merchant families through an astonishingly complex process, designed to prevent any faction from gaining control. The election process itself was a masterpiece of political engineering. involving multiple rounds of selection by lot and vote, creating a result that was part chance and part consensus. Once elected, the Doge wore the ceremonial horned cap, called the Corno Ducali, and lived in the magnificent palace on St. Mark's Square. He presided over ceremonies and represented the state to foreign powers, but his actual power was hemmed in on every side by restrictions that would have made most kings laugh in disbelief. He could not meet with foreign ambassadors alone. He could not open his own mail without state censors present. He could not leave the city without permission. His sons were barred from holding office during his lifetime. He could not name his successor. He was simultaneously the most honored man in Venice and one of the most constrained. The real power in Venice lay with the great merchant families, the families whose ships sailed to Alexandria and Constantinople, who traded in pepper and silk and slaves, whose warehouses lined the Grand Canal. These families understood that their prosperity depended on stability, on preventing any single family from achieving dominance, on maintaining a balance of power that would allow commerce to flourish without the disruption of civil war or tyrannical oppression. To achieve this, they created the Great Council, eventually comprising hundreds of members from the noble families of Venice. This council was the ultimate source of authority in the Republic. It elected the members of all the smaller, more specialized councils that actually ran the day-to-day business of government. There was the Senate, which handled foreign policy and major financial decisions. There was the Council of 40, which served as a high court. There were councils for military affairs, for trade regulations, for public works, each carefully balanced, each checking the power of the others. But perhaps the most feared and famous institution was the Council of 10, established in the 14th century as a kind of state security service. This small secretive body was tasked with rooting out conspiracies and treason, with protecting the Republic from internal threats. Its agents operated in secret. Citizens could anonymously denounce their neighbors by placing written accusations in special stone letterboxes mounted on walls throughout the city, called the Bocca di Leone, the lion's mouths. The accused would be investigated in secret, tried in secret, and if found guilty, might simply disappear into the Republic's dungeons or be executed quietly in the dark of night. It was a system built on institutionalized paranoia, on the assumption that ambition was the great threat to liberty, that eternal vigilance was the only protection against tyranny. Yet it worked, while the rest of Europe tore itself apart in endless succession wars. While kings murdered their brothers and nobles plotted against their monarchs, Venice remained stable. Deutsch succeeded Deutsch in orderly fashion. The great families competed for influence through legal means, through service to the state, through successful commercial ventures, rather than through civil war. This stability was Venice's secret weapon. It allowed them to focus their entire energy and their considerable genius not on internal power struggles, but on external expansion, on building the commercial and naval empire that would make them legendary. The government of suspicion had created the conditions for unprecedented prosperity and power. In the eastern corner of Venice, behind towering brick walls and guarded gates, lay the true heart of the Republic's power. This was not the Doge's palace with its Gothic splendor, not St. Mark's Basilica with its glittering mosaics. This was the Arsenal di Venezia, and it was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. It was both shipyard and armory, both factory and fortress, the place where Venice's dreams of maritime empire were transformed into physical reality, one ship at a time. The arsenal's origins reached back to the 12th century, but by the 14th and 15th centuries, it had evolved into the largest industrial complex in all of Europe, covering some 45 hectares, about 15% of the entire city. It was surrounded by 2 miles of defensive walls, punctuated by guard towers. Entry was strictly controlled. Foreigners were not permitted inside. Even Venetian citizens who did not work there could not enter without special permission. What happened behind those walls was a closely guarded state secret, and for good reason. The arsenal contained Venice's greatest competitive advantage. What made the arsenal revolutionary was not just its size, but its method of production. In an age when most shipbuilding was done by small craftsmen working individually or in small teams, when each ship was a unique creation built slowly from start to finish by the same group of workers, the arsenal pioneered what we would today recognize as assembly line production. They had discovered, centuries before Henry Ford, the power of standardization and division of labor. The process began with mass production of standardized parts. Throughout the arsenal's vast complex, dedicated workshops hummed with specialized labor. In one building, master craftsmen did nothing but produce identical rudders, each one precisely measured and built to exacting specifications. In another, teams of rope makers spun the thousands of feet of rope that every ship required, their hands moving in practiced rhythm day after day. Elsewhere, sailmakers cut and stitched vast expanses of canvas. Blacksmiths forged anchors and chains. Carpenters shaped oars and masts. Each workshop focused on a single component, producing them in vast quantities and storing them in enormous warehouses until they were needed. When it came time to actually assemble a ship, the process was breathtakingly efficient. A pre-built hull would be towed into the arsenal's production canal, a long waterway that flowed through the heart of the complex. This hull would then move slowly down this canal, stopping at a series of stations like an ancient version of a modern car moving down an assembly line. At each station, specialized teams of workers called the arsenalati would swarm, installing components they had mastered. At the first station, one team would install the rowing benches and internal structures. The ship would move on, and the next team would step the mast and attach the rigging. At another station, workers would hang the rudder and install the steering mechanisms. Further down, the ship would be outfitted with its oars, each one identical and interchangeable. Near the end of the line, armorer would install the ship's weapons, first crossbows. The efficiency of this system was almost unbelievable to foreign observers. There are accounts of visiting dignitaries who, during demonstrations of Venetian industrial might, watched in astonishment as a complete warship was assembled, armed, and made ready for sea in the time it took them to eat a leisurely meal. At the height of its power in the 16th century, the arsenal employed some 16,000 workers and could produce nearly one fully equipped ship per day when operating at full capacity. To put this in perspective, most European kingdoms would require months to build a single warship. The arsenalati were not ordinary laborers. They were an elite workforce, skilled craftsmen who took immense pride in their work. The Republic understood their value and treated them accordingly. They received guaranteed lifelong employment, something almost unheard of in the medieval world. They were paid regular wages even when work was slow. They received pensions in their old age. Their families were provided for if they died in service. In return for this security, they gave the state absolute loyalty and maintained strict secrecy about the techniques they employed. The arsenal produced not just warships but also the great merchant galleys, These vessels, propelled by both oars and sails, were the workhorses of Venetian commerce, capable of carrying enormous loads while still being able to fight if threatened by pirates or rival powers. The arsenal's ability to rapidly produce these ships, to replace losses and expand the fleet as needed, gave Venice a flexibility and power projection capability that no rival could match. This was the foundation of everything. The Doge's palace might have been where political decisions were made, but the arsenal was where those decisions were transformed into power. Every ship that sailed from Venice, every naval victory, every successful trading voyage, every expansion of the Republic's empire, all of it ultimately depended on the smoke and thunder and ceaseless labor behind the walls of the arsenal. It was the beating heart of iron that pumped warships into the sea like blood through Venice's veins. On one day each year, the full glory and unique character of Venice was put on display for all the world to see. This was the Feast of the Ascension, and on this day the Republic celebrated the most important ritual in its entire calendar, a ceremony that perfectly captured the soul of a state that had been born from water and would live or die by its relationship with the sea. This was the Sposalizio del Mare, the marriage of the sea, and it was unlike any state ceremony performed anywhere else in the world. The centerpiece of this festival was a vessel that embodied everything Venice aspired to be: magnificent, powerful, and utterly unique. This was the Bucentaur, the Bucentoro in Venetian dialect, the Doge's state barge. It was not a warship. It was not even designed for practical travel. It was a floating work of art, a statement of power and wealth, carved in wood and covered in gold. The Bucentaur was immense, over 100 feet long, propelled by dozens of the arsenal's most skilled oarsmen. Its entire surface was covered in elaborate carvings of mythical scenes and allegorical figures, all heavily gilded with gold leaf that glowed like captured sunlight when the barge was brought out into the lagoon. When the morning sun struck the Bucentaur, witnesses said it looked like a golden mountain floating impossibly on the water. On the morning of the Feast of the Ascension, the Doge would emerge from his palace dressed in his most magnificent ceremonial robes, the famous horned cap upon his head, surrounded by the highest officials of the Republic. Foreign ambassadors from kingdoms across Europe and beyond would be present, invited to witness this uniquely Venetian spectacle. The Doge would board the Bucentaur, and the great barge would begin to move, its banks of oars rising and falling in perfect synchronization. But the Bucentaur did not travel alone. Following behind it came a procession of hundreds of vessels, a floating parade that included the elaborate gondolas of noble families, merchant ships dressed with flags and banners, vessels carrying musicians whose music drifted across the water, boats filled with citizens of every class, all dressed in their finest clothes. The entire lagoon became a moving tapestry of color and sound and celebration. Church bells rang from every campanile in the city. People lined the shores and crowded the bridges, cheering as the procession passed. The air was filled with the scent of incense from churches, mixed with the salt temps of the sea. The destination of this magnificent procession was the Lido Inlet, the point where the protected waters of the lagoon met the open expanse of the Adriatic Sea. Here, at this threshold between the known and the unknown, between safety and danger, between Venice and the wider world, the procession would halt. The flotilla of following boats would fan out in a vast semicircle. Silence would fall across the water, broken only by the cry of seabirds and the gentle lapping of waves. The Doge would rise and move to the forward part of the Bucentaur. In his hands, he held a consecrated golden ring, blessed by the clergy and created specifically for this ceremony. He would raise the ring high above his head so that all assembled could witness, and in a strong, clear voice, he would recite the ancient Latin vow that had been spoken by his predecessors for centuries: Desponsimus te, mare, in signum, veri perpetuique domani. We wed thee, O sea, in sign of true and perpetual dominion. And then, as thousands watched in reverent silence, he would cast the ring into the waves. It would flash gold in the sunlight for just an instant before disappearing into the dark blue water, a treasure given freely to the sea as a bride price, a yearly offering to renew the sacred compact between Venice and the element that had birthed it and sustained it and made it great. The ceremony was many things at once. It was a prayer for the safety of Venetian sailors, a hope that the sea would be kind to their vessels and their ventures. It was a thanksgiving for the prosperity that maritime trade had brought to the Republic. It was a statement of religious devotion, an acknowledgement that all power ultimately came from God and must be exercised with humility. But it was also, unmistakably, a declaration of political power. When the Doge proclaimed Venice's perpetual dominion over the sea, he was not speaking metaphorically. He was announcing to any rival power that might be listening that the Adriatic was Venetian territory, that Venice claimed the right to control who sailed these waters and under what terms. For the people of Venice, this annual ritual was profoundly important on a level that transcended politics or economics. The sea was not merely their highway or their source of wealth. It was the fundamental reality of their existence. Their roads were water. Their city floated upon water. They were born within sound of water and would die within sight of water. To be Venetian was to be married to the sea in a way that no land-based people could ever truly understand. The ceremony of the marriage of the sea made this existential truth sacred, transformed it from mere fact into divine covenant. In this moment each year, Venice and the sea renewed their vows to one another, and from this marriage, an empire would be born. As the 13th century dawned, Venice had grown from a refuge of displaced Romans into a formidable commercial and naval power. Its merchants traded in every port of the Mediterranean. Its ships commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Its treasury was filled with gold from the lucrative spice trade. But it was still, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small city-state, hemmed in by more powerful neighbors and rivals. What happened next would change everything, would transform Venice from a regional power into a true empire. And the path to this transformation led through treachery, greed, and one of the most shameful events in medieval history. In the year 1202, Pope Innocent III declared the Fourth Crusade, calling upon the warriors of Christendom to sail to Egypt and strike at the heart of Muslim power in the Holy Land. The nobles of France and the Holy Roman Empire answered the call, assembling a magnificent army of knights and soldiers. But there was a problem. They needed ships, a massive fleet to transport 33,000 men and 4,500 horses across the Mediterranean. There was only one power in Europe capable of providing such a fleet: Venice. The leader of Venice at this critical moment was a man who would become legendary, Doge Enrico Dandolo. He was ancient by the standards of the time, in his 90s, and he was completely blind. Yet his mind remained sharp as any blade, and his ambition for Venetian glory was limitless. When the Crusader envoys came to negotiate, Dandolo saw not just a business opportunity, but a chance to reshape the balance of power in the entire Mediterranean. The deal they struck was staggering. Venice agreed to suspend all its normal commercial activities for over a year, dedicating the entire industrial might of the arsenal to building the Crusader fleet. The price was 85,000 silver marks, an almost incomprehensible sum. The Crusaders agreed, confident they could raise such funds. But when the Crusader army finally assembled at Venice in the summer of 1202, disaster struck. Far fewer Crusaders had arrived than expected, and they could only pay a fraction of the agreed price. Now both sides faced catastrophe. A massive armed foreign army was trapped on an island in the Venetian lagoon, unable to fulfill their holy vow to liberate Jerusalem. Venice was on the brink of bankruptcy, having invested everything in a fleet that might never be paid for. The situation was untenable, and into this crisis stepped the blind Doge with a proposal that would scandalize Christendom. The Crusaders could, Dandolo suggested, pay off their debt not in silver, but in service. And their first target would not be Egypt or the Holy Land. It would be Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that was a trading rival of Venice. Many Crusaders were aghast at this perversion of their sacred vow. Some abandoned the expedition in disgust. The Pope explicitly forbade the attack, threatening excommunication. But the majority, trapped by debt and desperation, agreed to seal the deal and silence doubters. The ancient blind Doge performed a masterstroke of political theater. During a solemn mass in St. Mark's Basilica, with the entire Crusader army present, he dramatically took the cross, declaring that he himself would join the crusade despite his age and blindness. How could warriors in their prime refuse to follow where this venerable old man was willing to lead? The fleet sailed, and Zara fell after a brief siege. The Crusaders had broken their vows and attacked fellow Christians to pay their debt to Venice. But this was only the beginning. As the army wintered and conquered Zara, a new opportunity presented itself in the form of a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, who promised to pay the Crusaders' entire debt and fund their expedition to Egypt if they would help him claim the throne of Constantinople. For Dandolo and Venice, this was beyond their wildest dreams. Constantinople was the wealthiest city in Christendom, and it was also Venice's greatest commercial rival. The chance to place a friendly, indebted emperor on the throne was worth any risk. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet appeared before the massive walls of Constantinople. What followed was almost unbelievable: a Christian army besieging the greatest Christian city in the world. The initial assault succeeded, and the young Alexios was installed as co-emperor, but he quickly discovered he could not pay what he had promised. Tensions escalated until he was overthrown and murdered in a palace coup. With no hope of payment and facing a hostile new regime, the Crusaders made their fateful decision. They would take their payment by force. In April of 1204, they launched a full assault on Constantinople. The Venetian fleet, with its specialized knowledge of naval warfare, was crucial to the attack. Venetian ships fitted with siege towers allowed attackers to storm the seawalls. After desperate fighting, the defenses crumbled, and the Crusader army poured into the city. What followed was one of history's most notorious atrocities: the sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade pillaged the wealthiest city in Christendom. Priceless holy relics were stolen or destroyed. Ancient manuscripts were burned. Magnificent bronze statues were melted down for their metal. Churches were desecrated. The great library of Constantinople, repository of countless ancient texts, was largely destroyed. Citizens were murdered in the streets. The accumulated wealth and cultural treasures of 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization were looted or annihilated in 72 hours of madness. When the orgy of destruction finally ended, the spoils were divided. The French knights took territory, carving out feudal kingdoms from the carcass of the Byzantine Empire. But Venice took what mattered most for a maritime commercial power: strategic assets. They claimed 3/8 of Constantinople itself, including prime harboring facilities. They took the famous 4 bronze horses that would be placed atop St. Mark's Basilica. Most importantly, they secured a string of key ports and islands throughout the Aegean, including the massive island of Crete. In one stroke of ruthless opportunism, Venice had transformed itself from a regional power into a true Mediterranean empire. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land, but it had made Venice unimaginably wealthy and powerful. The price was paid in treachery and Christian blood. In the aftermath of Constantinople's fall, as French and German Crusader lords scrambled to establish their feudal kingdoms across former Byzantine territory, the Venetians played a far more calculated game. They had no interest in ruling large rebellious populations far from the sea or managing sprawling agricultural estates. Such ventures required armies and administrators and constant military expenditure to suppress uprisings. That was not the Venetian way. Venice's genius had always been commercial, and now they would create a new kind of empire, one perfectly suited to a republic of merchants, the Stato da Mar, the state of the sea. Rather than claiming vast territories, Venice claimed the sea routes themselves. From the wreckage of Byzantine power, they carefully selected a chain of islands and coastal ports that stretched like a strand of pearls from the Venetian lagoon all the way to the Black Sea. Each pearl in this maritime necklace served multiple purposes: safe harbors, where merchant ships could take refuge from storms; fortified naval bases, where Venetian warships could be stationed to control the surrounding waters; and commercial outposts, where goods could be collected, stored, and transshipped back to Venice. Together, they formed an unbroken highway of safe passage under Venetian control. The strategic vision was brilliant in its simplicity. A Venetian merchant vessel leaving the lagoon and heading east would travel from friendly port to friendly port, never having to venture far into hostile waters, always within reach of Venetian protection and Venetian law. This dramatically reduced the risks of long-distance trade, which had always been plagued by pirates, storms, and hostile powers. With the Stato da Mar in place, Venetian shipping became safer and therefore more profitable than anyone else's, giving Venice an enormous competitive advantage. The crown jewel of this maritime empire was the massive island of Crete, known to Venetians as the Kingdom of Candia. Crete's position in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean made it invaluable. From there, Venice could control shipping lanes in every direction. The island itself was wealthy, producing wine and grain and other valuable exports. For over 4 centuries, Crete would remain under Venetian rule, defended by massive fortifications and a permanent Venetian military presence. The capital city of Candia, modern Heraklion, was transformed into one of the most powerfully fortified cities in the Mediterranean. Its walls and bastions a testament to how seriously Venice took the defense of its key possessions. Beyond Crete, Venice controlled a constellation of strategic locations. In the Ionian Islands near Greece, they held Corfu, a critical gateway, controlling access to the Adriatic. Throughout the Cyclades, they claimed key islands that commanded the Aegean Sea. Along the coast of mainland Greece, they secured ports like Modon and Corinth, so important they were called the Eyes of the Republic for their strategic value in watching over eastern trade routes. They controlled key portions of the Dalmatian coast, including the city of Zara, that had been the first prize of the Fourth Crusade's diversion. Each possession was chosen not for size, but for strategic and commercial value. This was not an empire of settlement or colonization in the way we usually think of empires. Venice did not send large numbers of colonists to populate these territories. The local populations, mostly Greeks, continued to farm and fish and live their lives, much as they always had. What changed was who ruled them and who collected their taxes. Typically, Venice would send a governor called a rhetor, a Venetian nobleman appointed for a term of years, to oversee each major possession. He would be accompanied by a small administration and a garrison of soldiers, but the actual population remained overwhelmingly local. Venetian rule in these colonies tended to be pragmatic rather than ideological. Venice cared about 3 things above all: that the colony pay its taxes, that it remain loyal and not rebel, and that it facilitated rather than hindered Venetian commerce. As long as these conditions were met, local customs and even local laws were often left largely intact. This practical approach to imperialism generally made Venetian rule less oppressive than it might have been, though of course the subjects of the empire did not choose their rulers and had no say in how they were governed. The military defense of the Stato da Mar required constant vigilance and enormous expense. Venice maintained permanent naval squadrons that patrolled the sea lanes, hunting pirates and showing the flag to remind everyone who controlled these waters. The fortifications of key positions like Crete were constantly maintained and upgraded as military technology evolved. When threats emerged, Venice had to be prepared to send fleets and armies thousands of miles from home to defend possessions that might be under siege for months or even years. Yet all this expense was justified by the incredible wealth that flowed through this system. With the Stato da Mar in place, Venetian merchants could trade more safely and efficiently than anyone else in the Mediterranean. Goods from the Far East, precious spices and silks and gems, could be brought to Venice with unprecedented reliability. These goods would then be transshipped over the Alps or by sea to the hungry markets of northern Europe, with Venice taking its profit at every stage. The maritime empire of pearls had transformed Venice into the undisputed commercial hub of the Mediterranean, the essential link between East and West.